Today's recording is part two of the message that started on Sunday. The message on Sunday was, here, I put it away too far before I could reach. This fear gives poor advice. That was part one of this fear and arrogance two-parter. And part two is arrogance deceives. I'm uploading this because with the governor's new order to work at home, I'm going to try and do that. And I don't have the connection speed to reliably live stream, I think, at home, so I'm going to record these next few messages in advance and just upload them. So hopefully it comes out just the same. In today's story that we read from John, the Gospel of John, you know the characters. Really, you understand the characters in today's story of Jesus because you met them. Obviously, you didn't meet the same person that Jesus met, but either at work or in a club that you belong to, or perhaps at school, or somebody that you've seen on television, somewhere you have met someone who was exactly like the people that Jesus is talking to. You know them. These are the people, male or female, who are never wrong. But more than that, not only can they never be wrong, they're so full of themselves that they can't even imagine, they can't even conceive of the possibility that they might be wrong. These are the people who are always quick to offer advice. They never want your advice in return. They would almost certainly dismiss your advice or ignore you if you offered them advice. And often this person is referred to as perhaps a narcissist, but that's a psychological diagnosis of an extreme case. While we might run into an occasional narcissist, far more often we will encounter people who are just bulldozing their way through life, bulldozing the people around them, while they themselves are just filled with their own arrogance and pride. Today, we remember the story of Jesus, healing a man who was born blind, a man who spent his days begging at the gates of the temple to earn enough money in order to survive. But after he's healed by Jesus, the man and his family are hounded by the Pharisees, who, despite the evidence of his healing and despite his first-hand eyewitness testimony, if you will, as well as some sound logical and theological evidence, the Pharisees refuse to, well, let's read the story. It's a little long, but bear with me, because it is one of my favorites, and I think it'll be worth it. We're reading from the Gospel of John, John chapter 9. This is just about the whole chapter, so like I said, it's a little bit long. As Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." Excuse me. "As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with his saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. He replied, "The man they call Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes, and he told me to go to Siloam and wash, and so I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. "What do you have to say about him? It was your eyes that he opened." The man replied, "He is a prophet." They still didn't believe that he had been blind and received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one that you say was born blind? How is it now that he can see?" "We know he is our son," the parents answered, "and we know that he was born blind. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." Now his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who had already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. "Give glory to God by telling the truth," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." He replied, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, and now I see." Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" And he answered, "I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples also?" And then they hurled insults at him. And they said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are the disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." And to this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me, so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking to you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshipped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, "What? Are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim that you can see, your guilt remains." So here we are, at the beginning of the story. Jesus and his disciples are walking towards the temple. They see the blind guy, and they say, "Who sinned?" What they wanted to know was, whose fault is it? Whose fault is it that the man was born blind? The commonly accepted wisdom was that any illness or any defect must be a punishment from God. So, if somebody was born blind, who was God trying to punish? How was it possible for someone to sin before they were born? And if it wasn't the unborn child that sinned, how could how could God punish an unborn child for the sins of his parents? That doesn't sound right either. But Jesus assures them that the man's blindness wasn't anybody's fault. The world in which we live is broken, and bad things happen. Not everything, not everything that's bad happens because God is out to punish people. Instead, bad things offer us, the church, offer us opportunities to do the work of God in our world. With that, Jesus sends the man to go and wash and be cleansed, to be healed of his blindness, and he does, and he is. Once the man is healed, not surprisingly, people notice. Everyone who had ever known him or who had ever walked past him on the way to the temple, they knew that he was blind. Some people were so sure that blindness could never be healed that they insisted that it must not be him, it must just be somebody that looked like him, until he insisted that he was indeed the same man. Even the Pharisees noticed. But rather than being impressed that Jesus had done the impossible, rather than being amazed that a man who had been blind since birth now stood before them with his vision restored, the Pharisees were upset. The Pharisees were upset that Jesus had the audacity to spit and make mud and perform a healing on the Sabbath when people were commanded not to work. Really? That was their issue. The Pharisees couldn't believe that this was true. And so not only did they question the man who had been blind, they called his parents in as witnesses to verify that he was, in fact, their son. He was, and he had indeed been born blind. Excuse me. They said that he was. But because they knew that the Pharisees had threatened to essentially excommunicate anyone who said that Jesus was the Messiah, the parents refused to answer any further questions. They told the Pharisees that they should ask their son, who had been healed, if they had any other questions. After that, the Pharisees sent for the man a second time. They insisted that he was lying the first time, that this time he should come clean, give glory to God, and tell the truth this second time, because they know that Jesus is a sinner. It's at this point in the story that I begin to wonder if the blind man was deliberately trolling the Pharisees and really trying to make them angry. He says, I don't know if Jesus is a sinner, but I know that I used to be blind and now I'm not. And they persist in asking the same questions that he already answered the first time. He asks them if they want to follow Jesus and become his disciples. This, of course, throws them into a rage. But the man just keeps poking at them with the truth. He says, now that's remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody ever heard of opening the eyes of a man who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. With that, they insult him, and they throw him out. But even though they threw him out, some of them must have followed him, or they followed Jesus, because they were there when he finally meets Jesus, when he sees Jesus for the first time. And in that conversation, Jesus declares that it's the Pharisees that are the real blind men. While everyone was trying to decide whether the blind man or his parents were guilty of sin, it's the Pharisees, Jesus says, that bear the real guilt, because they claim to see while they are ignoring the truth. Like those people that we have all met, The Pharisees were so sure of themselves, so certain that they were right, they couldn't even conceive of the possibility that they might be wrong. Despite the evidence, despite the testimony of a man that they had all walked past or stepped over on the way to the temple, a man they knew to be a blind beggar, a man that his parents testified that he was blind and had been blind since birth, they didn't believe him. And the only option they had left was to place blame. And they blamed the man who had been healed. They were so sure of themselves, the only option they had left was to blame the victim. But Jesus said that the real blame was on the Pharisees. The guilt and the sin was theirs. They were blind because they refused to admit the facts that stood right in front of them, and it was their arrogance that blinded them. We see the same thing all the time. The flat earth people think that thousands of scientists and engineers are part of an enormous, elaborate hoax because they can't bring themselves to admit that maybe somebody understands the world of mathematics and physics better than they do. We see it on social media today in people who would rather believe in an international conspiracy than to believe that a microscopic virus is still capable of shutting down the entire world in the 21st century. And we still see it in the lives of people who see Jesus transform the lives of people they know. They see people cured of incurable diseases. They see prayers answered. They see the hungry fed. They see the naked clothed. But they always seem to find another way of excusing it, or transferring the blame, or transferring the credit somewhere else. But arrogance leads to sin. Never forget that arrogance deceives. Don't be afraid, folks. Don't be afraid to change your mind when you find the truth. Don't be afraid to hear the truth. And never allow yourself to get tired of sharing that truth with the people around you. Have a great week, everybody.